The morning air in Washington was brisk, and the White House press room was buzzing with its usual chatter. Reporters from across the country gathered for President Trump's press briefing. But one reporter stood quietly at the back, clutching an envelope in her hand. Her name was Clara Jensen, a 29-year-old journalist from a small-town newspaper in Iowa. Unlike others chasing sensational headlines, Clara was there with something personal, something that had nothing to do with politics or policy. She had debated for weeks whether she should deliver it. The letter inside wasn't an interview request, nor a political question. It was a story, a deeply human one. It was about her father, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had passed away last year, leaving behind a legacy of kindness, resilience, and a final wish that Clara still couldn't shake. As Trump finished answering questions, Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. She wasn't sure he would even take it. Presidents didn't have time for small-town letters, but something inside her urged her forward. She waited until the cameras were off, then approached the podium. "Mr. President," she said softly, this isn't for the press. It's personal." Trump glanced at her, clearly surprised. She extended the envelope. For a moment he hesitated. Then, without a word, he took it, nodding slightly before being whisked away by his aides. Clara stood frozen, unsure if he'd ever open it. She didn't know that within the next 24 hours, the words she had written would pierce through the walls of politics and pride and change expression in Donald Trump's eyes forever. That evening, deep inside the private quarters of the White House, Trump sat at his desk. The usual chaos of his day, meetings, policy briefings, urgent calls had given way to a rare silence. A stack of folders sat neatly in front of him, but his eyes wandered to something else. The plain white envelope resting by his pen holder. He remembered the young woman's steady but nervous voice. Something about her tone had felt different. He opened plenty of letters from citizens every week, but most were formal requests, political opinions, or blunt criticism. This one felt heavier. With a quiet sigh, he broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly smudged in places as if tears had fallen on the page during its writing. "Dear Mr. President," it began. "My father, Daniel Jensen, served in Vietnam. He came home with medals, but also with memories he never spoke of. He always believed that leaders should see people, not statistics. I'm writing because of something he asked me before he died." Trump's eyes lingered on those words. He leaned back, reading slowly, the room dim, except for the soft golden glow from his desk lamp. What began as polite curiosity quickly shifted into something else. Clara's words weren't just about her father. They were about sacrifice, forgotten heroes, and the way people in power often moved past individual stories without truly listening. By the time he reached the second page, Trump realized this wasn't a political plea. It was a call to remember something deeper, and it was about to keep him awake far longer than he expected. While Trump sat with the letter, Clara was back in her small Washington hotel room, pacing by the window. She replayed the moment she'd handed him the envelope. Did she sound foolish? Did she look unprofessional? Her father had been the heart of their small Iowa town. He coached Little League even when his health declined. He repaired neighbors' fences in the dead of winter. And he never once asked for thanks. But what haunted Clara was his last hospital conversation. "Clara," he'd whispered, his voice raspy. "Promise me you'll tell someone who can actually do something about the others. The forgotten ones, the veterans with no parades, no cameras, no voice." She promised. But a promise that big felt impossible to keep until she saw the White House press list showing Trump would be taking questions the next week. Something told her this was her moment. Still doubts noted at her. What if he never read it? What if it was tossed into some staff inbox, never to see daylight? Clara sank into the bed, the city lights glowing outside. She didn't care about making headlines. She only wanted her father's final wish to reach someone with the power to honor it. Far away in the White House, that very thing was already happening. Midway through reading, Trump noticed a folded photograph tucked into the envelope. He pulled it out. It was a black and white picture of a young man in uniform, Daniel Jensen, smiling while holding a helmet under his arm. His eyes had the same determined look Clara carried. On the back in Clara's handwriting it read, "He never stopped serving, even when no one noticed." Trump's fingers lingered on the edges of the photo. He thought about the countless military members he'd met, each one with a story far richer than the few minutes they usually got to share. He read on. Clara described the Veterans Center in her town, underfunded, understaffed, and home to men and women who had quietly slipped out of the nation's awareness. She told him about George, who lived in his truck because the wait list for housing was too long. About Linda, a nurse who had served 3 tours, but now rationed her medication because her pension barely covered rent. Her father had tried to help them all, sometimes skipping his own treatments to pay for someone else's groceries. The last line of the letter read, "Mr. President, I'm not asking for money or for a bill to be passed. I'm asking for a moment to see them, not his numbers, but his people. That's all my father wanted." Trump stared at the words, silent. Something inside shifted. Not the politician, but the man. That night, Trump couldn't sleep. He paced his private study, the letter still in his hand. Politics often hardened people. Every issue was reduced to strategy. Every story measured by its public impact. But this letter refused to be categorized. It reminded him of faces he'd met on campaign trails. Veterans who shook his hand without asking for anything but a little attention to their stories. He thought of his own father, who had taught him that real strength wasn't about never bending, but about knowing when to stop and listen. At 2 a.m., he picked up the phone and called one of his aides. "I want a list of small-town veteran centers, places no one talks about tomorrow morning, and find me the contact for Clara Jensen." The aide, groggy, mumbled an acknowledgement. Trump hung up and looked out the window at the sleeping city. Clara's words echoed in his mind. A moment to see them. He didn't know exactly what he would do yet, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this letter become another unread story in the archives of forgotten mail. The next morning, Clara's phone rang just as she was pouring coffee. The caller ID made her freeze. Private caller, White House. She picked up cautiously. "Miss Jensen, this is the office of the president. The president would like to speak with you." Her hand tightened around the mug.
"Me?
"Are you sure?" A moment later, another voice came through, firm, but unexpectedly warm. "Clara, this is Donald Trump. I read your letter, every word." She swallowed hard, unsure what to say. "I want to know more," he continued. "About your father, about these people he cared for. Can you meet me this afternoon?" Her mind raced. She had no prepared notes, no agenda, only the truth. Yes, of course. As she hung up, Clara felt the weight of her promise to her father pressing down on her. This was it. She had no idea where it would lead, but she was about to walk into the most important conversation of her life. Clara arrived at the White House just after noon, her nerves humming like a live wire. An aide escorted her through the ornate corridors until they reached the Oval Office. Trump was already there, the letter and photograph on his desk. He stood to greet her. "Clara, sit down." She did, hands clasped in her lap. "I get letters every day," he said. "But yours, it wasn't politics. It was human. Tell me about your father." So she did. She told him about Daniel Jensen's easy laugh, his long hours at the Veterans Center, and the way he never turned away anyone in need. She spoke about the forgotten heroes, men and women who had given everything but received little in return. Trump listened, leaning forward. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," she said, her voice tight. "But there are so many like him who are still here, and they're invisible. My father used to say that sometimes the smallest gesture from the top can ripple out farther than you imagine." Trump was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I think I need to meet them myself." The president's schedule was notoriously rigid, but by the next morning, Clara was on a plane back to Iowa. This time with the White House press secretary and 2 Secret Service agents in tow. Trump had quietly arranged a visit to the small Veterans Center Clara had described. No media leaks, no cameras, just a promise that he would see the place firsthand. In Iowa, word spread quickly that someone important was coming, but few believed it would actually be the president. George, the homeless veteran Clara had mentioned, was skeptical. Presidents don't visit places like this, he muttered. Linda the nurse shook her head. If it's true, maybe he'll listen. Or maybe it's just for show. Clara could only hope her father's story had planted something genuine. The Sense parking lot was nearly empty when the black SUVs rolled in. Trump stepped out, dressed in a dark overcoat. His usual brisk stride slowed as he looked around. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The walls were lined with faded photographs of soldiers, some smiling, some solemn. George was the first to speak. "You're really here," he said almost in disbelief. Trump extended his hand. "I wanted to see this place. Clara told me about it and about you." One by one, the veterans gathered, some hesitant, others curious. Trump didn't give a speech. Instead, he walked from table to table asking each person's name, what they'd done in the service, and what life had been like afterward. It wasn't the booming political figure they saw on television. He was quieter here, his eyes focused, his tone softer. George eventually told his own story, how he'd served 2 tours, come home to a factory job, and lost everything when the plant closed. He'd been living in his truck for 2 years. Trump listened without interrupting. "What do you need most right now?" he asked. "Not charity," George replied. "Just a chance to work again. A place to sleep that isn't freezing in the winter." Trump nodded slowly. "I can't fix every problem overnight, George. But I can start here." Clara watched from the side, amazed. Her father would have loved this. Leaders not giving speeches, but listening. Linda's turn came next. She spoke of her years as a combat nurse, patching soldiers together in the middle of chaos. Now she was retired, but her pension barely covered her medication. "I'm not asking for myself," she said. "I'm asking for the others like me, the ones who don't speak up until it's too late." Trump looked at her for a long moment. "You've spent your life serving others. Maybe it's time someone served you." He took out a small notepad and began jotting down notes, a habit Clara didn't expect from him. After hours of conversations, Trump asked Clara to show him the rest of the center. She led him to a back room with rows of empty chairs. "This was supposed to be our job training space," she explained. "But we never got the funding, so it just sits here." Trump stood in the doorway, silent. The emptiness spoke volumes. Missed opportunities. Dreams stalled before they began. He turned to Clara. "This doesn't stay empty. Not anymore." On the drive back to the airport, Trump stared out the window. The small houses, the frost-covered fields, the quiet streets. This wasn't the Washington he was used to. He finally said, "Clara, your father was right. Seeing people changes everything." She smiled faintly. That's all he wanted. Trump didn't say more, but Clara could tell he was already planning something. 2 days later, Clara was back in Washington at Trump's request. He met her in the Oval Office, the letter still on his desk. "I can't solve every problem," he began, "but I can keep promises. We're going to fund that training room and more like it across the country." Quietly. No big press releases. Clara's eyes widened. Why quietly? "Because this isn't about politics," he said. "It's about people." A month later, Clara stood in the Veteran Center back room, now buzzing with activity. Desks, computers, instructors, and most importantly, hope filled the space. George was learning computer repair. Linda was mentoring younger veterans studying nursing. The air felt different, brighter, warmer. Trump never appeared for a ribbon cutting, but Clara knew he was watching from afar. Word spread quietly among veterans' communities. Soon, other small-town journalists began writing their own letters, stories of forgotten heroes in hidden corners of America. Trump began reading them every night. His aides noticed the change. He seemed more reflective, less quick to dismiss small stories as minor. A year later, Trump returned to Iowa without warning. He walked into the Veterans Center to find George behind a desk, employed full-time as the tech instructor. Linda was healthier, smiling as she handed out training schedules. They were stunned he remembered their names. But he did. Clara realized that her father's wish had not just been fulfilled. It had grown. A single letter had rippled into dozens of programs across the country. She thought of her father's voice. One person seeing you can change everything. On his next visit, Trump asked Clara to walk with him outside. The winter air was sharp, their breath visible. Clara, he said, your letter didn't just change my mind. It changed my eyes. I can't unsee these people now. For a moment his voice caught. And in that flicker of emotion, she saw not the public figure, but the man. Years later, Clara still kept a copy of the letter in her desk drawer. Not because she needed to remember what she'd written, but to remind herself of what it had done. Her father's photograph now hung in the Veterans Center, framed above the words, "A moment to see them." Trump never spoke publicly about their work, but Clara knew the truth. Sometimes the most powerful changes aren't shouted from podiums. They're carried in the quiet shift of someone's eyes. And that shift had begun the night a president opened a plain white envelope and found a daughter's promise inside.